On the morning of March 14, 1973, a woman named Barbara Henderson walked into a Safeway supermarket in McLean, Virginia, unaware that 3 Soviet intelligence officers were watching her from different angles. One pretended to read a newspaper near the produce section. Another examined canned goods he would never purchase. The third sat in a brown Chevrolet Impala across the parking lot, recording the exact time she entered, what she wore, and how long she stayed. Barbara was 32 years old, mother to 2 children, and married to a mid-level analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. She had no security clearance, no access to classified documents, and no idea that her Thursday grocery run had been documented in a file that would eventually contain over 400 pages of surveillance notes, photographs, and behavioral analysis. Her husband, David Henderson, worked in the Soviet Analysis Division, a unit responsible for tracking military movements in Eastern Europe. He had never told her anything about his work beyond vague references to paperwork and long meetings, but the KGB had determined, through a program that would remain hidden for nearly 2 decades, that the wives and children of American intelligence officers could reveal more about operations than the officers themselves ever would. The program had no official name in KGB records, at least none that survived declassification. Internal memos referred to it simply as Secondary Target Observation Protocol, a bureaucratic designation that masked the invasive nature of what it actually entailed. The logic was straightforward and deeply cynical. Intelligence officers were trained to recognize surveillance, to vary their routines, to communicate through dead drops and coded messages that left no traceable pattern. But their families operated in the ordinary world. They shopped at the same stores, attended the same schools, kept the same appointments. They complained to neighbors about broken appliances, mentioned upcoming vacations in casual conversation, and left small clues about household stress that could indicate changes in their husband's work schedule or emotional state. To the KGB, these were not innocent civilians. They were unwitting intelligence assets, and every detail of their lives was potentially valuable. The operation began as a pilot program in 1971, focused on 10 families living in the Washington, D.C. area. By 1975, it had expanded to include over 60 households, with surveillance teams rotating through shifts, tracking patterns, and building psychological profiles that read like intimate biographies of people who had committed no crime beyond marrying someone with a government job. Barbara Henderson was designated Target 7 in the files that would later be handed over to American authorities as part of a limited intelligence exchange in 1992. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the documents revealed a level of detail that disturbed even seasoned counterintelligence professionals. Soviet watchers knew that Barbara bought whole milk instead of 2%, that she preferred Tide detergent over generic brands, and that she always paid in cash when purchasing items at the pharmacy. They knew her children attended St. Luke's Elementary School and that her daughter, Emily, had violin lessons every Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon. They knew Barbara's mother lived in Pennsylvania and that she called every Sunday evening, usually between 7 and 8. They knew she had started smoking again after quitting 2 years earlier, and that she kept the cigarettes hidden in a blue ceramic jar on top of the refrigerator. None of this information, taken individually, seemed particularly sensitive, but compiled over months and cross-referenced with known CIA operational patterns, it formed a mosaic that allowed Soviet analysts to make educated guesses about what David Henderson might be working on, when he might be under stress, and whether his personal life might make him vulnerable to recruitment or blackmail. The operational theory behind this surveillance was rooted in a simple observation that Soviet intelligence had confirmed through decades of experience. People lie to their governments. People lie to their employers. People even lie to their friends. But in the privacy of their homes, in the routines of their daily lives, in the small moments of frustration or affection with their families, people reveal the truth. A husband who comes home late 3 nights in a row might be working on something urgent. A wife who suddenly starts seeing a therapist might indicate that her husband is struggling with classified information that he cannot share. A child who mentions that daddy will be traveling next week provides a window into operational timing that even the most carefully constructed cover story cannot fully obscure. The KGB had learned that human beings are creatures of habit, and that habits, once catalogued, become predictable. And predictability in the world of intelligence is a vulnerability that can be exploited with patience and precision. The surveillance methods used were deliberately low-tech to avoid detection. No phone taps were installed on the Henderson household, as those would have required court orders and created paper trails that American counterintelligence might eventually discover. Instead, Soviet watchers relied on physical observation, often conducted by officers operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet Embassy or the United Nations mission in New York. These officers had legal immunity, which meant that even if they were identified as intelligence operatives, the worst consequence they faced was expulsion from the country. They rotated assignments frequently, ensuring that no single watcher became too familiar to local residents or law enforcement. They used commercial cameras available in any photography store, avoiding specialized equipment that might draw attention. They dressed like ordinary Americans, drove American cars purchased through third parties, and spoke fluent English with regional accents that made them blend seamlessly into suburban Virginia neighborhoods where CIA families often lived. The goal was not to gather intelligence through dramatic confrontations or covert break-ins. The goal was to become invisible, to watch and record and analyze until patterns emerged that could be used to predict behavior, assess vulnerability, or identify opportunities for exploitation. Barbara Henderson, like most of the women in the program, never suspected she was under surveillance. Why would she? She was not a spy. She had never signed a secrecy agreement or attended a classified briefing. Her husband worked for the government, but so did thousands of other men in the Washington area. She lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood where children played in the streets and neighbors borrowed lawnmowers from each other. There was nothing in her life that suggested she was a person of interest to a hostile foreign power. And yet, the watchers were there. They were there when she drove her children to school, navigating the morning traffic with a travel mug of coffee in the cup holder. They were there when she met her friend Linda for lunch at a diner on Route 7. Listening from a nearby booth as the two women talked about meal planning and the rising cost of groceries. They were there on Saturday mornings when she took Emily to violin lessons, noting the exact time she arrived and departed, cataloging the instructor's name and the location of the music studio. They were there when she walked the family dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, through the neighborhood park, observing which paths she preferred and whether she spoke to anyone along the way. Every detail was recorded. Every movement was analyzed. And slowly, over weeks and months, a profile began to emerge. The Soviet analysts who reviewed the surveillance reports were trained to look for anomalies, deviations from established patterns that might indicate stress, secrecy, or change in the target's household. If Barbara suddenly started shopping at a different grocery store, that was noted. If she made an unusual purchase, such as luggage or camping equipment, that suggested possible travel plans. If she appeared tired or distracted, that could indicate her husband was working longer hours or dealing with a crisis at work. If she argued with her children in the parking lot, that pointed to household tension that might make David Henderson more vulnerable to pressure or recruitment. The watchers were instructed to remain objective, to avoid speculation, and to report only what they observed. But the analysts were free to interpret, and their interpretations were based on a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the stresses inherent in intelligence work. They knew that CIA officers were forbidden from discussing their work with their spouses. They knew this created emotional distance and resentment in many marriages. They knew that financial pressures, combined with the knowledge that one's husband was involved in morally ambiguous work, could create cracks in a relationship that might eventually be exploited. And they knew that wives, more than anyone else, could sense when something was wrong, even if they could not articulate what it was. David Henderson, according to declassified CIA personnel files released in 2003, had joined the agency in 1968, shortly after completing his master's degree in international relations at Georgetown University. He was not a field officer. He had never worked undercover, never handled a foreign agent, and never carried a weapon in the line of duty. His job was to read reports, analyze data, and produce written assessments that would be distributed to senior officials and policymakers. It was cerebral work, often tedious, and far removed from the glamorous image of espionage that popular culture had created, but it was also important work. In the early 1970s, the Soviet Union was engaged in a massive military buildup, deploying new missile systems, expanding its naval presence, and testing the limits of détente through proxy conflicts in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Understanding Soviet intentions required careful analysis of fragmented intelligence, and analysts, like David Henderson, were the ones who connected the dots. He worked long hours, often bringing home stress that he could not explain to his wife. He drank more than he used to, usually bourbon, poured into a glass he kept on his desk in the small study where he retreated most evenings. He slept poorly, sometimes waking in the middle of the night with his mind racing through scenarios and contingencies that he could not discuss with anyone outside the agency. And he was, by all accounts, completely unaware that his wife's movements were being tracked by a foreign intelligence service. The KGB's interest in Barbara Henderson intensified in the summer of 1974. When surveillance teams noted a sudden change in her routine. For 3 consecutive weeks, she drove to a location in Arlington that she had never visited before, a small office building near Clarendon Boulevard. She entered the building at approximately 2 in the afternoon and remained inside for exactly 50 minutes each time. The watchers could not determine what she was doing inside without risking exposure. But the regularity of the visit suggested an appointment, possibly medical or therapeutic in nature. This information was relayed to Moscow Center, where analysts cross-referenced it with known CIA patterns. One possibility was that Barbara had started seeing a psychologist, which could indicate marital problems or personal distress related to her husband's work. Another possibility was that she had taken a part-time job, which could suggest financial difficulties in the Henderson household. A third, less likely but more intriguing possibility was that she was involved in some kind of activity that David Henderson did not know about, which could make her a potential recruitment target. Orders were sent back to the Washington station: increase observation, determine the nature of the visits, do not approach, do not take risks, just watch. It took 2 more weeks before the watchers identified the building's occupant. It was a speech therapist named Dr. Margaret Keene, who specialized in treating children with developmental delays and articulation disorders. Barbara was taking her son, Michael, to therapy sessions. The boy was 7 years old and had a stutter that became more pronounced when he was nervous or excited. There was nothing sinister about the visits, nothing that suggested espionage or betrayal. It was simply a mother trying to help her child. But even this mundane detail was recorded and analyzed. Soviet psychologists reviewed the information and noted that children who stutter often come from households with high levels of stress or inconsistent communication patterns. The presence of a speech disorder in the Henderson household was interpreted as further evidence that David Henderson's work was creating tension at home, and that this tension might eventually be leveraged. The KGB did not need Barbara or her children to be willing participants. They simply needed the family to exist as a source of pressure, a reminder to David Henderson that his choices affected people he loved, and that those people were vulnerable in ways he might not fully understand. The files also revealed something more disturbing. In at least 3 cases documented between 1973 and 1976, Soviet intelligence officers made deliberate contact with the wives of CIA analysts, not to recruit them, but to unsettle them. The approach was always indirect, always plausibly deniable. A chance encounter at a shopping mall, where a man with a faint accent struck up a conversation about the weather and casually mentioned that he had seen her at the same store last week. A wrong number phone call that came at an unusual hour, where the caller apologized in slightly awkward English and then asked, with apparent innocence, if this was the Henderson residence. A car that seemed to follow the same route home from the grocery store, staying 2 or 3 vehicles behind. Never close enough to be threatening, but noticeable enough to create unease. These were not aggressive acts. They were psychological operations designed to create a vague sense of being watched. A discomfort that the women might mention to their husbands, who would then have to decide whether to report it to CIA security or dismiss it as paranoia. Either choice created stress. Reporting it meant admitting that one's family had been noticed by hostile intelligence, which could lead to increased scrutiny, reassignment, or career damage. Ignoring it meant living with the gnawing possibility that the threat was real, and that one's spouse and children were in danger. The KGB understood that this kind of psychological pressure, applied subtly and intermittently, could be more effective than overt threats, because it left the target uncertain about whether anything was actually happening at all. Barbara Henderson never reported feeling followed or contacted by anyone suspicious, at least not in any document that survived declassification. But other wives did. In 1975, a woman named Carolyn Mathis, married to a CIA officer working in the Directorate of Operations, told her husband that a man had approached her in the parking lot of a giant food store in Bethesda. He had asked for directions to a nearby address, spoken with a slight accent, and then thanked her by name, even though she had not introduced herself. Her husband, Ronald Mathis, filed a security incident report, which triggered an internal review. The FBI was notified and a brief investigation was conducted, but no evidence of illegal activity was found. The man could not be identified, and no further contact occurred. The incident was classified as a possible provocation but ultimately deemed inconclusive. What the investigation did not know, because the relevant KGB files would not be accessible for another 17 years, was that the man was a Soviet intelligence officer named Yuri Dmitrievich Kuznetsov, operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy. He had approached Carolyn Mathis deliberately, not to gather intelligence, but to see if she would react, to measure her awareness, and to send a quiet signal that she had been noticed. It was a test, and she had passed by reporting it. But the test itself was designed to create fear, and in that sense, it succeeded. The most comprehensive case study in the declassified files involved a family named the Porters, who lived in Falls Church, Virginia between 1972 and 1977. James Porter was a senior analyst in the CIA's Office of Soviet Analysis, specializing in military logistics and supply chain assessment. His work involved predicting Soviet capabilities based on production data, transportation networks, and resource allocation patterns gleaned from satellite imagery and signals intelligence. It was highly technical work, far removed from the drama of field operations, but it was also strategically vital. Understanding how quickly the Soviet Union could mobilize its forces in a crisis depended on analysts like Porter being able to interpret fragmented data and make accurate projections. His wife, Susan Porter, was a schoolteacher who worked at a public elementary school in Arlington. She taught second grade, drove a pale green Ford station wagon, and volunteered at her church on Sunday mornings. She had 2 daughters, ages 9 and 11, who played softball in a local recreation league. By all appearances, the Porters were an unremarkable American family, indistinguishable from thousands of others living in the Virginia suburbs during the early 1970s. The KGB began monitoring Susan Porter in January 1973, assigning a dedicated surveillance team that rotated through 3-day shifts to avoid pattern recognition by American counterintelligence. The operation was more intensive than the Henderson case, likely because James Porter's position gave him access to higher-level intelligence assessments, and because his work directly informed policy decisions related to arms control negotiations and strategic force planning. The watchers documented everything. They knew Susan left for work every weekday at 7:15 in the morning, stopping at a 7-Eleven on Lee Highway to buy coffee and occasionally a newspaper. They knew she ate lunch in the school cafeteria with 2 other teachers, women named Patricia Halloran and Denise Crawford, and that the three of them usually talked about lesson plans, difficult students, and their personal lives. They knew Susan's older daughter, Jennifer, had braces, and that the family made monthly visits to an orthodontist in Vienna. They knew the younger daughter, Amy, was struggling with math and that Susan had hired a tutor who came to the house on Wednesday evenings. They knew the family dog, a beagle named Copper, had a tendency to bark at passing cars, and that the neighbors had complained about it at least once. They knew Susan's car needed new tires, and that she had postponed the repair twice because of the expense. They knew she subscribed to Better Homes and Gardens, and that she had recently started attending a book club that met at a public library in McLean on the first Thursday of every month. What made the Porter case particularly revealing was that Soviet analysts were able to correlate changes in Susan's behavior with known shifts in James Porter's work assignments. In April 1974, surveillance teams noted that Susan appeared more tired than usual, that she had stopped attending her book club for 2 consecutive months, and that she had been seen arguing with her daughters in the driveway on multiple occasions. Cross-referencing this with CIA operational patterns, Soviet intelligence concluded that James Porter was likely working on a high-priority project that required extended hours and increased security protocols. This assessment was later confirmed when declassified CIA documents revealed that Porter had been part of a task force analyzing Soviet naval deployments in the Mediterranean, a project that ran from March through June of 1974 and required analysts to work 12-hour days, 6 days a week. The KGB had inferred the existence of this project not through espionage or signals intelligence, but simply by watching a man's wife grow increasingly exhausted and irritable as her husband disappeared into his work. It was a stark demonstration of how much could be learned from the margins of a person's life, from the details that seemed too small to matter, but that, in aggregate, told a story that the person himself might not even recognize. The Soviet approach to analyzing this data was methodical and dispassionate. Field reports were sent to Moscow Center every 2 weeks, where they were reviewed by a specialized unit within the First Chief Directorate responsible for monitoring American intelligence personnel. The analysts who read these reports were trained to think in terms of leverage and vulnerability. They were not looking for smoking guns or dramatic revelations. They were looking for pressure points, moments of weakness, opportunities to insert doubt or fear or temptation into the lives of people who had access to valuable information. A wife who was unhappy in her marriage could be approached with sympathy and understanding. A family facing financial difficulties could be offered help, either directly or through intermediaries. A child with a serious illness could become a vector for emotional manipulation, a way to remind a target that his loyalty to his government came at a cost to the people he loved. The KGB understood that most intelligence officers would never betray their country for money or ideology, but that many might be persuaded to make small compromises if they believed it would protect their families from harm or hardship. There is no evidence in the declassified files that the KGB ever successfully recruited a CIA officer through surveillance of their family members, at least not during the period covered by the Secondary Target Observation Protocol. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the files themselves acknowledge that many operations were never committed to paper or were destroyed before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. What is clear is that the program created a climate of fear and uncertainty within the CIA once its existence became known. In 1979, following the defection of a mid-level KGB officer named Sergei Andreevich Morozov, American counterintelligence learned about the family surveillance program and launched an internal review to determine how many agency personnel might have been affected. The review was classified and its findings were never fully disclosed, but fragmentary references in later congressional testimony suggest that at least 75 CIA families were confirmed or suspected. Targets of Soviet observation between 1971 and 1980. Security. Protocols were updated to include warnings about routine variations and family awareness training. But the emotional toll on the affected families was harder to quantify. Knowing that your spouse and children had been watched, that their innocuous daily routines had been cataloged and analyzed by a hostile intelligence service, created a sense of violation that many officers found difficult to reconcile with their commitment to the work. Susan Porter, according to later interviews conducted by CIA security personnel, had no idea she was under surveillance until she was informed in 1980, 3 years after the program targeting her family had ended. The revelation came during a mandatory security briefing, delivered in a windowless conference room at CIA headquarters in Langley. She was shown photographs of herself taken from a distance, images that captured her walking into the grocery store, sitting in her car outside the orthodontist's office, standing on the sideline at her daughter's softball game. She was told that these photographs had been recovered from KGB files obtained through a defector, and that they were part of a broader intelligence operation aimed at destabilizing American intelligence families. The briefing officer, a woman from the Office of Security, explained that Susan had done nothing wrong, that she was not under suspicion, and that the surveillance had been purely observational. But Susan did not feel reassured. She felt exposed, angry, and deeply unsettled by the knowledge that strangers had been watching her for years without her knowledge or consent. She asked how long it had gone on, and the officer told her approximately 4 years, from early 1973 to late 1977. She asked why she had not been warned, and the officer explained that the CIA had not known about the program until after it had ended. She asked if her daughters had been photographed as well, and the officer hesitated before saying, yes, they had been. Susan left the briefing in silence, drove home, and told her husband that she wanted him to resign from the CIA. He refused, arguing that leaving would accomplish nothing and that the KGB had already moved on to other targets. They argued about it for weeks, a conflict that eventually subsided into a cold and unspoken resentment that would define the final years of their marriage. The psychological impact of the surveillance extended beyond the immediate targets. Other CIA families, upon learning about the program, began to question their own routines, to wonder if they too had been watched without knowing it. Parents became hyper-vigilant about their children's activities, reluctant to let them play outside or walk to school alone. Wives started varying their shopping schedules, avoiding familiar stores, and looking over their shoulders in parking lots. The sense of safety that had once existed in the suburban enclaves where intelligence families lived began to erode, replaced by a low-grade paranoia that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. For the KGB, this may have been the most successful outcome of the program, not the intelligence it gathered, but the fear it instilled. The reminder that even in America, even in the supposed safety of one's own neighborhood, the Cold War was always present, always watching, always waiting for a moment of weakness. The operational files also revealed a chilling attention to children. In several cases, Soviet watchers documented the daily routines of CIA officers' sons and daughters with the same thoroughness they applied to the wives. They knew which schools the children attended, which bus routes they took, which friends they played with after school. They knew about extracurricular activities, medical appointments, and family vacations. In one case involving a family identified only as Target 12, surveillance reports included detailed observations about a 10-year-old boy who walked home from school every afternoon, always taking the same route through a residential neighborhood in Alexandria. The reports noted the exact time he left school, the streets he used, and the house where he sometimes stopped to visit a friend. They noted that he carried a blue backpack and that he often stopped at a convenience store to buy candy. They noted that on Fridays his mother picked him up instead, and that the family usually went out to dinner at a pizza restaurant on South Washington Street. The level of detail was unsettling, and the implications were clear. If the KGB wanted to send a message, to apply pressure, to create a crisis that would force a CIA officer to make a desperate decision, the children were the obvious leverage point. There is no evidence that Soviet intelligence ever acted on this information. No documented cases of kidnapping or direct threats against minors. But the fact that they collected the information, that they built profiles on children as young as 6 or 7, suggested a willingness to cross moral boundaries that most intelligence services, even during the Cold War, publicly claimed to respect. The program eventually ended not because of American countermeasures, but because of changing priorities within the KGB itself. By the late 1970s, Soviet intelligence was increasingly focused on technological espionage, on stealing Western secrets related to computers, telecommunications, and military hardware. Human surveillance of family members was labor-intensive, expensive, and yielded intelligence that was often ambiguous and difficult to act upon. The operational return on investment was declining, and resources were redirected toward more productive targets. The secondary target observation protocol was quietly phased out between 1978 and 1980, with most surveillance teams reassigned to other duties. The files were archived in Moscow, where they remained until the early 1990s, when political upheaval and economic collapse made previously unthinkable intelligence exchanges suddenly possible. In 1992, as part of a limited cooperation agreement between the newly formed Russian Federation and the United States, a selection of KGB files related to Cold War operations was handed over to American officials. The family surveillance files were among them, delivered in cardboard boxes that had been sitting in a basement storage facility in Moscow for over a decade. American counterintelligence officers who reviewed the documents were stunned by the scope and duration of the program, and by the casual thoroughness with which Soviet operatives had invaded the private lives of American families. Barbara Henderson learned about her surveillance in 1993, 16 years after the last documented observation. She was contacted by a CIA security officer who requested a meeting to discuss a matter related to her husband's former employment. David Henderson had retired from the agency in 1989. After more than 20 years of service, and the couple had moved to a small town in North Carolina where they planned to spend their retirement. Barbara agreed to the meeting, expecting a routine security follow-up, or perhaps a request for information related to a historical review. Instead, she was shown copies of the surveillance reports that had been kept on her between 1973 and 1977. She sat in silence as the officer explained what had happened. How Soviet intelligence had watched her shop for groceries, take her children to school, meet her friends for lunch. She looked at photographs of herself that she had never known existed, images that showed her in moments she could barely remember, frozen in time by a camera held by a stranger with hostile intent. When the officer finished explaining, Barbara asked only one question. She asked if David had known, if he had been aware that his family was being watched while it was happening. The officer said no, that the CIA itself had not known until years later, and that David had been informed in 1980, but had been instructed not to discuss it with anyone, including his wife, because the information was classified. Barbara nodded slowly, absorbing this, and then she stood up and walked out of the room without saying another word. She never spoke to her husband about it, at least not according to the limited information available in later accounts. There was nothing in the official record about how Barbara processed this knowledge, whether it changed her view of the life she had lived or the choices her husband had made. But the silence itself was telling, a kind of grief that did not require words, a recognition that something had been taken from her that could never be returned. The years she had spent in McLean, raising her children and managing her household and believing that her life was private and ordinary, had been an illusion. She had been watched, catalogued, analyzed, reduced to a collection of data points in a file that was never meant for her to see. And the man she had trusted to protect her, the man she had married and built a life with, had worked for an institution that had kept this secret from her for over a decade, even after the threat had passed. The betrayal was not David's alone. It was systemic, institutional, a reminder that in the world of intelligence, even the innocent are never truly safe, and that secrecy, once it becomes a habit, corrodes everything it touches. The documents that survive declassification offer only a partial picture of the secondary target observation protocol. Many files were destroyed before the Soviet Union collapsed, either as part of routine security procedures or in the chaotic final months when KGB officers burned records to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. Other files were withheld from the intelligence exchange, deemed too sensitive or too embarrassing to share even decades after the fact. What remains is a fragmentary archive, a collection of surveillance reports, analytical assessments, and operational summaries that hint at a program far larger and more invasive than what has been publicly acknowledged. Historians and intelligence scholars who have studied these documents estimate that the true number of American families targeted was likely in the hundreds, and that similar programs were probably conducted against British, West German, and French intelligence personnel during the same period. The Cold War was not only a conflict between governments and ideologies, it was also a war against families, against the private lives of people who had committed no crime beyond choosing to serve their countries, and whose punishment was to live under the shadow of an invisible threat that they could never fully escape. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile privacy really was during those years, how the machinery of intelligence operated not only in the shadows of power, but in the ordinary spaces where people live their lives, consider what it means that we are only now learning the full extent of what was done. These are not just historical curiosities. They are warnings about the cost of secrecy, the human toll of suspicion, and the ease with which institutions can justify the surveillance of the innocent in the name of national security. The families who were watched, the wives who were photographed, the children who were cataloged in KGB files, they were not enemies. They were people trying to live normal lives in a world that had decided normalcy was a vulnerability. And the fact that it took decades for the truth to emerge, that Barbara Henderson and Susan Porter and dozens of others had to live for years without knowing they had been targeted, speaks to a deeper failure of accountability, a willingness to treat human beings as collateral damage in a conflict that promised to protect them, but instead made them expendable. The Cold War ended more than 30 years ago, but the files keep surfacing, the secrets keep emerging, and the people who lived through it keep discovering that the lives they thought they had lived were not entirely their own.